Then they make their way from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. They get to Kadesh Barnea and get stopped. 12 men, each representing one tribe of Israel, were sent out to spy the land. They were to report if it's possible to take the land of Canaan. Well, the 12 men, each representing the one tribe of Israel, and while all had glowing reports of the boundary of the promised land, 10 of the men expressed fear concerning the size of the Canaanites, and they doubted that they had the ability to take over the land. Do you know, Pauline, Lois, do you know, she's laughing, 2 men came back with a good report and 10 men decided they couldn't do it. Do you know one of those men, Dorothy?
Joshua and Caleb, C-A-B-L-E or something.
That's
C-A-B.
That's right. And because of this,
C-A-B-E-B-L-E-B.
Caleb, the reason now, okay, so 10 men, so they decided not to go. And the Israelites rebelled against God and refused to attack the Canaanites. And this led to God's judgment upon the first generation of Israelites who were delivered from Egypt's bondage in chapters 10 through chapter 14. So because they did not go in to the land of promise and take it as God said, they rebelled against God. God says, you're in trouble. And for 40 years, almost 38 years, the generation of Israelites had to wander about the wilderness until virtually all died. It took 38 years for the first generation of people that came out of Canaan, they had to die. They could not go into the promised land, those that were above a certain age. They wandered, that wandering period, along with the settling down of certain laws, is described in chapters 15 through chapter 19. Well, then chapter 20, the second generations of Israelites set out towards Moab, the launching point for Israel's invasion of Canaan. Well, along the way, Israel comes to the wilderness of Zin, the same place to which the Israelites had come shortly after they crossed the Red Sea. So 40 years later, they end back up where they came out of Egypt 40 years hence. They could have crossed over. You've seen maps, it could cross over, but they refused to do it. Exodus chapter 16 and verse 1. Again in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 5. And Moses is instructed to, quote, speak to the rock. And by this means to produce water for the people to drink. In his anger, he smote the rock twice with a rod, chapter 20, this is in chapter 20, verses 10 and 11. And for this act of irreverence, what?
He wasn't allowed to go.
That's right. Moses himself forfeited to enter the promised land, chapter 20, verses 12 and 13. So God is not, it's Moses. I mean, I can understand smoting the other people. They're bummers. But here's Moses. Here is Moses. He is the Moses, the writer of the Pentateuch, the top dog. And God says, sorry, God is no respecter of persons.
I felt sorry for Moses.
I do too.
I really did.
Because he had to put up with a bunch of whining.
He did, didn't he, though? And this is also the time for Aaron. to be gathered to his people, quote. That is for Aaron today. So his priestly garments are removed from him and placed on his son Eleazar. Then, in the sight of all the congregation, Aaron ascended to Mount Hor, and he dies in verse 22 through verse 29. And all these events signal the end of an important chapter in Isaiah's history. A chapter which begins at the Exodus and which concludes with the death of that generation, Israelites, who had failed to trust and obey God. So Aaron and Moses of that generation, they both died. And that was the end of that generation. Well, in the final section of the book of Exodus, Numbers, it deals with the second generation of Israelites as they prepare to enter in and possess the land of Canaan. And these chapters describe the journey of the Israelites as they approach the promised land, chapters 21 through chapter 25. And the people are numbered in preparation for war, chapters 26 and 27. And they are instructed concerning God's requirement for their conduct, chapters 28 through chapter 36. It is in this closing section of the book of Numbers that the account of Balaam is found. And that's where we pick up the story. When the Canaanite king of Arad heard that the Israelites were coming to attack them, taking some Israelites captive, God gave this king and his people into the hands of the Israelites, and they were utterly destroyed because they had captured some Israelites. And God said, that ain't going to work. Numbers chapter 21, verses 1 through 3. Leaving the Mount Or, the Israelites sought to pass by Edom along the coast of the Red Sea. But they become impatient. And they began to what? As they always did. Grumble. Complain. And God sent a fierce serpent among the people. Remember that as a divine judgment? And many died. And when Moses interceded with God, he was instructed to make a brazen serpent, which chapter 21, Moses chapter 20, Numbers chapter 21, to make a brazen serpent with which he was to lift up for the people to see. Lois, you remember now what happens?
Yeah.
Do you remember what happens, Jimmy?
If they lift up,
he lifted up the serpent, and God, I'm teasing Lois, and God said what, Dorothy?
He said, look at the serpent, they wouldn't die.
If they looked at the serpent, they wouldn't die. They would look at the brazen serpent and live. The remainder of chapter 21 describes those events immediately preceding the introduction of Balaam in chapter 22. Israel is making its way to Pisgah, in verse 20, which seems to be a ridge near the top of Mount Nebo. And this spot provided a panoramic view of the Promised Land. It is from Pisgah that Moses will view the Promised Land before the death on Mount Nebo, Deuteronomy chapter 34. And when the Israelites sent a messenger to Sihon, Sihon, the king of the Amorites, asked for permission. He asked for, the messenger asked for permission to pass through his land, and the king refused. He is assembling his army to wage war against him. Deuteronomy, Numbers chapter 21. You got chapter 21? Numbers 21. You have that handy, Numbers 21, verses 21 and 23. Pauline, you want to read that?
And Israel sent messengers to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, saying, Let me pass through the land. We will not turn into the fields or into the vineyards. We will not drink of the waters of the well, but we will go along by the king's highway until we be past the borders. And Sihon would not suffer Israel to pass through his border, but Sihon gathered. Is that how you pronounce that, Sihon?
Yeah.
And she gathered all his people together and went out against Israel into the wilderness. And he came to Jahaz and fought against Israel.
And guess what?
And Israel smote him with the edge of the sword and possessed the land, or he possessed his land from Aram into Jabbok, even unto the children of Ammon. For the border of the children of Ammon was strong.
God said, you can possess the land.
Yeah.
And the king said, I don't want you to pass through. And they were already going to do it well. I mean, they were just going to pass. They were just going to pass through. They weren't going to do anything. You see, in those days, what I've been learning is that I forgot what they were called. Abraham. They were called. What they did was they were like Indians. They never settled in one place. And they would go from one place to another place to another place to another place to another place. Huh?
Is that nomads? Is that
Nomads.
Nomads.
Thank you. They were nomads. Israelites were nomads. And so was Abraham nomads. And what they would do is they would go from one place to another place and they would settle down for a while. And what would happen is, like with Abraham, his clan grew and grew and grew. And he needed more land. So his job was to go to whoever was ruling in another part of the country, part of the land, and ask permission to purchase this land so that they could have a place. Because they had to get permission from one group to another group to another group to pass over, or it would cause war. And Abraham wanted to do things right. It's a fascinating story that I never got to. There's so much I never say that I wish I could say to help you learn how marvelous this story was. And that's where he ended up buying property. Abraham bought property from another clan leader in order to bury his wife. Well, anyway, and then they captured Jazer, defeated and disposing of the Amorites who lived there. That's in verse 32. And going by the way of Basham, B-A-S-H-A-M, the Israelites encountered Og. Did you know, I think that was the name of the horse that won the Kentucky Derby? Or was it O.G.? Was it O.G.?
Orb. Now,
who won yesterday? Who won the Prince?
Now that might have been.
When it O.G.
What was it?
He
It was
didn't-
O something.
I know.
Probably OMG.
Yeah, anyway, when I saw the king of Basham. Yeah.
Something like that, Orbit, maybe Ovid or something.
Yeah, that's what I
seen
kind
it this morning,
Okay, I did
Richard had
too.
it on for you.
And so he came, the king of Og, the king of Basham, who comes out to fight them. And like Shinar, Ogar is defeated, and the Israelites possess his land as well in chapter 33 through verse
Where are
35.
you reading that there? Where do you get that name? I want to.
That isn't that 33 through 35? Read that again.
Okay.
21, 33 through 30. We'll read it. What's it saying?
Go ahead.
No, you can have, I
No,
know
you
you
read.
know. No, I can't.
She can't read, she can't see. Go ahead, somebody.
What do you want to read?
33, 35.
And they turned and went up by the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan.
OG?
Oh,
How you want to pronounce it? I'm a southerner. I have to pronounce it my way. Go ahead.
Went out against them, he and all his people, to the battle at Edrei.
Whatever.
And the Lord said
That's
to
what I say.
Moses, Fear him not, for I have delivered him into thy hand, and all his people, and his land. And thou shalt do to him as thou didst unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, which dwelt at Heshbon. So they smote him and his sons and all his people until there was none left him alive, and they possessed his land.
Okay, when I was doing the book of Acts, when I taught the book of Acts, what I would do is you can listen to, I had tapes on the book
And
of
you
Acts,
listened to that.
and I listened to the pronunciation, and I practiced pronouncing the words so that I could say them right, because I'm not a phonic person. I didn't learn phonics. There's not a word that Charity cannot pronounce, and there's rarely a word she cannot spell. She knows phonics, and if you know phonics, you can do that. But I didn't learn phonics, so I had to suffer through all this. Okay, and as I remember, selegtite and selegmite. You know, this is back in 1970. I was going to preach at a church, and I was going to use this illustration, selegmite and selegtite, and I practiced and I practiced and I practiced and I practiced. When I got up there to preach, I couldn't see either one of them. I was only 20 years old after I got married. Well, anyway, okay. The Israelites, chapter 22 now. Chapter 22. Now, aren't you already interested in the book of Numbers? Isn't that cool?
Yeah, I'm going back and reading.
Isn't that neat?